Hello, my name is Andrew Holbrook. I'm here from the Edgewood University Library on November 3rd, 2025, and I'm speaking over Zoom with,
Bill Duddleston. My official name is William B. Duddleston, but everybody at Edgewood knew me as Bill. So
and you taught at Edgewood for nearly 45 years.
45 years, yes, yes. Now, not all of that was full time, but it was majority of it's full time. And I worked overtime a lot. I mentioned during the weekend degree program, I especially put in a lot of hours. So, but it was worth it. It was a lot of fun, a lot of fun.
So we have a lot of ground to cover in our
Yeah,
oral history today,
yeah.
and I'd love for you to take us back to your origins and talk a little bit about where you grew up.
Well, I grew up on the near south side of Chicago, near the river, the south branch of the river, near the stockyards, not too far from the stockyards, near White Sox Park, and near some very interesting neighborhoods, Pilsen on the other side of the river, which is primarily Hispanic. And then the Brownsville area where I went to high school, I went into the high school area, and it was the kind of the origins of the Chicago blues. So I had a lot of historical background just by living everyday life. And also, my father was born in an area that was known as the Levee, and that was the red light district, and that eventually became Chinatown. Back then, when he was born, 1909, it was a pretty tough area, and my grandmother has lots of stories, and I recorded those. So I'm very interested in oral history and history in general, just how Chicago evolved, and so that was a important place to grow up in. I went to St. Bridget's Grammar School on Archer Avenue, the second oldest parish in the city, and I graduated from there in 1958. So I was born in 1944 during the war. And then I went on to De La Salle High School, run by the Christian Brothers at 35th in Michigan. And I started in 1958 and I graduated in 1962. And then I went up to St. Norbert College in West De Pere, Wisconsin, just south of Green Bay. And then I entered there in 1962 and graduated in 1966 in economics. So I got my interest in economics started when I actually got a job downtown in Chicago, working in a brokerage firm back in 1960. And so I worked there until 1966, off and on, not consistently. But I learned a lot about the world of finance, and that's where my interest in economics was kind of developed. My parents were, my father only went to eighth grade, had to go to work after that. Parenthetically, he tried out for baseball and was in the minor leagues for 3 years, and then played semi-professional ball in Chicago for about 10 years. And my mother finished grammar school at St. Bridget's in 1924, I think, and then finished her 2-year commercial degree 2 years later, which was quite unusual then. Women just didn't go to school beyond grammar school then in my neighborhood. And so she got a very good job at Cadillac Motor Car Company at 22nd in Michigan. And if you want to hear a story, she actually rubbed shoulders sometimes with Al Capone through an unknown person who supposedly was an FBI undercover agent. So that's a story I can't prove, but my mother was quite the character. She was a doing the Charleston and going to dances, and she had plenty of young men after her, but my father was able to lure her away. So then they were married in 1935. My brother was born in 1936, James. My sister Nancy was born in 1937, and Lori was born in 1940. So we had 4 children in a very small flat. And I lived in that neighborhood and grew up in that neighborhood. Hung out at a place at 31st and Morgan called the Shack. That's a kind of a natural place. We got to hang out somewhere. I played sports at Bosley Playground. I played about 6 or 7 different sports and learned, in a sense, street culture pretty well. But when people say, well, were you in a gang? I was in a gang, but I was also told Duddleston, go home. You're going to get in trouble. So older people looked out after me, knowing that that was not my life. I was just hanging out, having fun, playing sports. And so always went back home. So I had a very stable, loving, educative home life. My sister Nancy was my role model. She went to the first one in my family to go to college, in an extended family, big family. And then she finished in 1960 with a degree from DePaul University. And she read to me, she guided me. So she was probably my most important intellectual influence, besides my father and my mother, who were super. We would engage in political discussions all the time because my neighborhood was the infamous home of Mayor Daley, and so politics was an important topic. My father was not a Daley fan, and we talked a lot about economics, what was happening in the war. There was a program called the Irv Kupcinet Show, and it started at 11 o'clock at night on Saturday. So I would come home about 11, and we would sit up until about 2 o'clock in the morning watching that program with all kinds of interesting people who contributed to my education. And I did it with my parents, which was a great experience for me. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of my growing up. And then I went to the University of Wisconsin, 1966, just as everything began to heat up with the anti-war movement. And so I was a TA there. I was instrumental in getting the Teaching Assistants Association started in 1968. And then we had, obviously, lots of confrontation. We had a month-long strike in 1970 from March 15th to April 15th. And I was a steward for the econ department. We had, so I was very active in lots of non-academic activities in Madison. And then, as luck would have it, a little sign went up on the bulletin board in the econ department and says they were looking for a part-time instructor to teach at Edgewood College. And I said, well, I'll go walk down the street. Didn't take me long. And I had an interview with Sister Esther Heffernan, had a great time with her. And then I went and interviewed with the president, Cecilia Carey, and she was wonderful. And we became lifelong friends. And she was president for the first 8 years I was at Edgewood. And then I would go and visit her at the Mound. And so she lived to be about 95, and her mind was as sharp as could be. So I have very strong friendships. Sister Esther, obviously, for 45 years, and Sister Cecilia, and many, many, many other sisters that were part of the Cincinnati Order. Okay, so that's kind of a quick overview of my initial years. Teaching at Edgewood, I started teaching a 4-credit course in macroeconomics, and then I taught a course with Sister Esther called Conflict, Change, Revolution in sociology. And then a course called Economic Problems, which was more of a microeconomics course, but I made it more applied and more relevant to the students who were taking it. There were very few people interested in in-depth analysis of economics. So I had to be very general, historical, political, sociological. And that was my training. So I was able to use my diverse training and readings to hopefully make it an interesting experience going to my classroom. So I taught lots of different courses. I'm not going to go through all the courses I taught. They would come up to me and go, "Can you team teach us?" Oh, sure, I'll team teach it. I'll work with Mike Lightberger. I'll work with Sister Esther. I'll work with Jean McSweeney. I mean, Jean McSweeney was the academic dean. She and I taught a course called The Political Economy of Energy, 1978. Great course. We learned a lot. I don't know how much the students learned, but we had a great time. So I was very flexible in with whom I worked, and collaborated with Cindy Rowling for many years, Frank Casale, Kevin Billow, all kinds of interdisciplinary activities. So I taught for 45 years, and I taught statistics, and I taught data analysis, but that wasn't my main interest. And so, any questions on that?
So you've given us a wonderful overview of your fascinating life, and I'd like to go back and revisit a few of the points
Sure.
that you've covered. One thing you mentioned in some of the notes you sent me before we recorded this conversation was that you were named after an uncle.
Yeah. Mhm. My uncle
Could
William John, he was most of my uncles were drafted into the war. My father had already had three children, so he didn't go in. But I had five uncles that were in the war, and he was the youngest uncle. And he was deployed into North Africa, and then they moved up to Sicily, and then they moved eventually into what is known as the Anzio crossing. They were trying to cut off the Germans, and so he lost his life on January 30th, 1944. So I was named after my uncle, and so that was always a very strong attachment to my grandmother, who had seven children, and six of them boys. And so whenever I would go into her house, there would be my name, but it would be with his name, but I was named after him. So, and I have a cousin who's also named after him. He's much, much younger than I am. And he went into the Army and became a lieutenant, a lifelong Army career man who became a lieutenant colonel. So there's two William Duddlestons, and there's another William Duddleston. He used to live near Laval, Wisconsin, but he died a few years ago. So a very uncommon name, but for the Duddlestons, James Duddleston and William Duddleston, there's all kinds of them running around.
So you came from a huge family.
Yeah, I have 35 first cousins, and we're very close, lived close nearby. And we had all kinds of events, picnics and gatherings. My grandparents, my mother's father was a peddler. And so he had a horse and a buggy, and he had a big yard. So that would be the gathering point right near the church that we belonged to, St. Bridget's. And so we had a very strong family grew up living. My siblings got married young. I didn't. I got married late. And my sister Lori had four boys. My sister Nancy had six children, five girls and a boy. And my brother married early, and he had three boys and three girls. So I have 16 nephews and nieces. I'm very close to them. And then I have 40 grandnephews and nieces. And I have about 24 great nephews and nieces. But they keep popping out, so I can't keep track. There's three more coming sometime soon. So the family is very close, and I'm the one who moved away. And I always felt obliged to come back and be part of the family. And I've maintained a very close relationship with my cousins, the ones that still are alive. And I'm very close to my nephews and nieces. Five of my nieces came over to visit me here in Switzerland 7 years ago. And my grandnephews and nieces, I keep in touch with by writing letters to them. So I'm happy that I've been able to maintain those contacts, even though I first moved to Green Bay, then to Madison, and then of course to Switzerland in 2015. So I do have a very close family. I'm proud of them.
And you were saying earlier that you were very close to your sister as an intellectual.
Yeah, my sister Nancy actually helps raise me because my mother had to go back to work for financial reasons. She worked the late shift. Well, it was kind of a half shift from like 8 o'clock at night till midnight. And so my sister Nancy would put me to bed when I was about 4 years old. But she would read to me, and she read to me all the time. And just because of who she was and how she handled herself, and she kept getting these scholarships and awards for her academic accomplishments. She was a kind of a path breaker in our family. Most of my cousins, male cousins, didn't finish. I was the first male Duddleston to finish high school. And then I was obviously the first male to go to college, and then I went to graduate school. So yeah, I was always a little bit different. Now in subsequent generations, many of them have done very well. And I'm proud of my grandniece, Kristen, who got a 4-year ride to the University of Chicago. And she's a real gangbuster. She's got 2 master's degrees. I'm sure she'll get a PhD. And she has 4 kids too. So, so I've got some unusual nephews and nieces. They're doing quite well. So, but my sister Nancy was the path breaker. She was the one who showed us the way.
Wow.
And she majored in medical technology, was more science oriented. So, yeah.
That's very impressive. I'm curious, was it hard being the first male in your family to accomplish those educational milestones, or did it not seem um, like something notable at the time?
I didn't think about it until I got to graduate school.
Hmm.
In other words, the transition to graduate school at Madison was probably the more disjunctive one, where I was a little bit out of my element. Like I would dress the way I felt like dressing, and someone who was from Georgetown as an undergraduate says, "Why do you dress this way?" And he sort of put me down for wearing Chuck Taylor tennis shoes and things like that to class. And so I began to feel not alienation, but just difference. But then, there were so many other graduate students who were just like me, coming from backgrounds not that dissimilar from me. So I think it was more 50-50, which was a good thing. And then at TAA, the Teaching Assistants Association, most of us had common roots. And that's why we were involved in more social justice issues, et cetera. So I didn't feel it in college. The people I went to school with at St. Norbert's were very similar to me, except they thought I was a little weird because I was in a big city like Chicago, and they were from small towns like Plymouth and Sheboygan and Fond du Lac and Eden, Wisconsin. But I loved going to see their homes, and I got to know their parents. And at that time, we would hitchhike. We didn't have cars, and we just hitchhike for the weekend and catch home baseball team, a home talent team. And then I enjoyed mixing with the people from St. Norbert's because they were very similar to me in background, but even though we were from different environments. So,
That's interesting. And you mentioned several ways that your environment, that your neighborhood had an impact on you growing up.
yeah.
It sounded
Well,
like,
one important one was my friends. I used to hang out with guys at the street corner, and two or three of them were at least 3 years older than me, and so they sort of took me under their wings, and they were already going to jazz clubs on the north side and the south side, and they were going to downtown to take advantage of downtown. So they were luring me already into that world that was different from my neighborhood. And they were, and one of them became a playwright, not a successful one, but he taught English, but he wrote plays. And I would go down to Chicago and see his plays, and a couple of other ones that were social workers, or they became engineers, etc. So the neighborhood was a very diverse group, and depending upon what kind of home they came from. See, but when I was growing up, about 70% of the families were stable. But by the time my nephews and nieces were still growing up in my neighborhood, by the time they grew up in the 70s, 30% of the families were stable and 70% were unstable. And that's where you began to see the breakdown in how they were growing up. And so my nephews and nieces actually didn't do that well academically and socially. And they've had some trouble. But they got out of it. But it took a while. And but I was lucky. I was able to sort of straddle that world of being part of the gang and being part of the group and hanging out at different places and having a teenage life. But I also was working downtown. I was going to movies. I was going to see the symphony. There was all those opportunities were there. You just had to be there and take the chance. And often I went by myself. I just said, okay, I'm after work. I worked from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. I'd go to the Grant Park for a symphony and listen to Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition. None of my friends went to that. None of them went to foreign films, but I did. I just said, I'm going to learn as much as I can from this other world. So in that respect, that's where striking out on your own and just taking a chance made a big difference for me.
right, that makes sense. And another area that you took from your uh, time in Chicago was your interest in economics and
Right.
finance.
Because
I'm wondering if you could expand on that.
well, first of all, I was growing up in the city, in the
Yeah.
1950s. And we would literally ride our bikes, and it seemed like it was every Thursday night, to a fire. The city was burning down. I mean, we talked about the Chicago fire in 1871, but the stockyards, literally, which was only about a mile from where I lived, was burning down in the 1950s. Those are all the stockyards. They used to bring all the cattle into Chicago, do the slaughtering there, and then distribute it from Chicago and refrigerate it. But what was happening is with the refrigerated trucks, they were moving the operations to places like Topeka, Kansas, and Abilene, Kansas, and Texas. And so the stockyards, in a sense that were built in the 1860s, were going through their demise. They were disappearing. And they used to employ 40,000 people. So I knew people that were losing their jobs, their families were losing their jobs. And so the city was changing. The other thing that was happening is the highways were coming in. They built the Kennedy Expressway, then they built the Eisenhower first, then the Kennedy, and so with the highways, many of the manufacturing firms that were in my neighborhood moved out of my neighborhood into the suburbs. And so all around me, my life was changing, my friends' lives were changing because of those economic changes. So I was going on my bicycle, we would go to these fires on Thursday night, and they were incredible as far as, you're 10, 12 years old, 13 years old. But I kept thinking about that. And so, one of the things I did in teaching was to tell stories. That I would tell stories about, well, what difference did it make that we had forklifts? That forklifts came in the 1950s and 1960s, and the forklift made it very easy to move goods around. You didn't need labor to unload things, but you don't do it in a multi-story building. All the buildings that burnt down were about 6 stories high. Now everything was horizontal. Everything was horizontal instead of vertical. And I just used that image to get across the whole transformation of the economy where I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, to explain that this is an ongoing process, that technological change, geographic change, locations, made a big difference for the economy. And so I got interested in that just growing up. And then I went down to LaSalle Street, and I was literally in the midst of the computer revolution, because the old people that worked at this firm that didn't want to have anything to do with computers. And so they would hire us to work overtime. There were some weeks I would work 70, 80 hours a week doing simple coding on punch cards. So they would do the punch cards that would then process the information for transactions. Then when I left to go to St. Norbert's, I would come back and they would ask me to work, but I was already seeing that this firm was falling behind the bigger firms that could mechanize and do all the computerizing. And then, of course, the Board of Trade, where I worked also briefly, and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, all began to do things electronically. So I would take groups of students and teachers down to see these things in action. But eventually, all those people, another 40,000 people employed in those kind of activities, lost their jobs when things became computerized with the internet. And so the whole notion of change was gripping me because I was living through it, and then I was trying to translate that into the classroom. So, and that made my life. I kept learning, and so I kept that information flowing to the students in my classes. So my growing up in Chicago, I think, made a big difference on how I taught economics. But I didn't teach at the University of Chicago. Because I used to start out sometimes with Monopoly and then move on to competition instead of starting with competition and going to Monopoly. So I was a little bit of a maverick. So.
And I want to learn more about that down the road when we get into your teaching career. But as you were observing all of these changes in the society around you, you were interested in them kind of from a macro perspective. You were thinking like an economist, it sounds like, even as a young teenager.
No, I was a divided person. I was already, my thinking, I was I always told students, but I was buying. My father would let me buy stocks with and so I had a good stroke of luck once, but I had two bad strokes of luck. But I would buy stocks. One that I always tell the students is I invested in a company that was having automatic dry cleaning machines. And I said, do you see any automatic dry cleaning places around town? And of course, no. But when I bought the stock, it was $3 a share, went to $6 a share. I bought more, went to $9 a share. But then got news reports coming in that they had these automatic dry cleaning machines where the customer had to set the dials to the right level. And if they didn't set it right, there'd be a fire. And of course, all these places burned down in lawsuits. Of course, and the stock went from $9 a share to 50 cents in about 2 weeks. So I lost my initial investment. But it was a good learning. It's a good story, right? But then I bought another company. It was doing defense work. And I bought it for $2 a share with my father. He bought it. So we bought 200 shares. The trouble was his car broke down. So the stock went to $8 a share. So we both had to sell it so he could buy his used car to get to work. But then it went to $80 a share. So I would have had 200. But those are stories. You win some, you lose some. And so but he allowed me to do those things. He said, well, you're interested in doing research. Do it. Here's your money. You're making good money. And I worked my tail off. I was working a lot of hours. So it was my money. And I could lose it if I wanted to. So those are just stories I would tell the students about that. People brag about making money in the stock market, or they brag about when they win at the races, or they brag about when they win at the lottery. But they don't talk about how much they lose along the way. So I always made sure that people realize that you got to devote your whole life to it. And I got to graduate school, I said, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in finding out how to do all kinds of things. And so I moved away from that part of my life. So when I came to Madison, that's when I began to go through a different kind of transformation. So, and I also learned how to drive finally, because I didn't know how to drive until I was quite old. So, and then when I could drive, I could, have a date, take someone out to a movie or something. So socially, I was a little backward. So.
Could you talk a little bit more about that transformation that you underwent? Because I'm curious how your interest in economics evolved from observing the world around you, and then you started studying it as an academic discipline. Did that interest kind of
the difference is that what I had an undergraduate economics teacher who his major area was comparative economic systems, and he had done his work on the Soviet economy. So I was very interested in how that worked theoretically and practically. And of course, what he did is he set up the difference between the theory of what Marx said versus the reality of the Soviet planning system, et cetera, et cetera. So I already learned that in undergraduate. I came to graduate school, and so for the most part, what was going on in economics at that time was the rise of mathematical economics, econometrics, and the kind of the sunset for something called institutional economics. So institutional economics used to be the mainstay of the UW-Madison School under John R. Commons way back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, et cetera. And so I was caught in that cross current. And so I was trying to hold on to the institutional framework, that you have to look at the institutions as they are, not as you think they should be. And so, and that spilled over into my interest in economic history and studying American economic history and teaching American economic history, especially as a TA. My professor used to let me take over. I would have 300 students that I was teaching when I was 22 years old. But I just put it all out there and learned about it. So I enjoyed the teaching of economics. I didn't like the research, very narrow research orientation. And I had three different dissertations that I put about 100 pages in each of them. And each one of them eventually got turned down because it was too journalistic. That was the word they used. So, and so I never finished my PhD to my chagrin, but I was able to survive and rise above that because I showed that I could teach and I was willing to do extra work for Edgewood. And so Edgewood was very, very good to me. Sister Alice O'Rourke, who was the second president I worked for. Well, I didn't believe in tenure. I said, I don't need tenure. I didn't, you know. But she came up to me. She said, I'm leaving. I think you should go up for tenure and I'll back you. And so I got tenure and I appreciated that. I tried to go back and get into some of the like business related stuff, but it was just not my cup of tea. So my sister, my mentor, Sister Esther, she just said, just do the good job for us, and we'll love you anyway. So that's my biggest failing. So it's always a PhD candidate, but I was never a PhD. But I think my students realized that I had a knowledge base that was worth listening to. So man, yeah, UW changed me a lot. I was anti-war. It was the anti-war movement. I was in draft trouble. Lots of my friends. I know 12 people that were killed in not I didn't know all of them real well, but I knew 12 people killed in Vietnam. It was a rupture in the society that made us look at why were we moving into that situation? How were we using our troops to pacify people that did not necessarily want to have the pacification? So it was a pretty tumultuous time. And of course, the Army Math Research Center was blown up in 1970, just as I went. I was living a few blocks away, so I saw them pull the bodies out. Those were hard things. Those were hard things to see. And a lot of my leftist friends just said, well, by any means necessary. And I just could not stomach that kind of callous attitude. So I was always walking between one group and another. And that's why Edgewood gave me kind of a little haven in a heartless world, that it gave me a place to grow and to give back what I knew to my students over those 45 years. And if you might have noticed, I even was the volleyball coach for a while. Did you see that? I volunteered with the volleyball coach, not for Kelvin Canyon. I didn't know how to coach volleyball. I didn't know how to play volleyball. And but I did it. And I did it for free. I helped start the women's basketball team with John Scar back in 1978. I didn't know how to coach, but we had fun. So it was just a place to be somebody who cared about other people. And that's why the cor ad loquitur, the symbol, the symbol of Edgewood that we use, cor ad cor, heart speaks to heart. And that to me is the essence of what my 45 years of teaching is all about.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to move into your time at Edgewood, especially some of your initial impressions of the sisters, because from hearing you talk about your schooling growing up, you had been educated by the Christian Brothers in high school.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what your initial impressions were of meeting Sister Esther and Sister Cecilia.
Well, Sister Esther was incredible because she was writing a book called Women in Prison, which is a famous book, and I helped edit it. I just did some proofreading, and a friend of mine helped. But it just, she was a superb intellect, but also had a big heart and had an interesting background. And so she and I were like, I was more concrete and she was more theoretical. So when we team taught, she would do the kind of the brush strokes and give the big picture and try to have the students see the larger issues that were involved. And then I would fill in the details and give more specific examples. So we had a really good working relationship. And then, of course, Jean McSweeney in chemistry, and then she became the dean. I've been friends with her until she died just recently. Just a wonderful person. We had canoe trips at the end of the year, and she and Esther, Tom McKenzie, who taught earth science, and his wife, Karen McKenzie, took students and faculty up to the boundary waters for 2 weeks at a time in birch bark canoes. And so we roughed it up and we got to know each other. But so, I know Jean and Esther from those. I know Loretta Dornish from the canoe trip. So we just brought everyday life to us and shared it and enjoyed it. We had lots of potlucks and meetings and coffee discussions. But that's when everything was in Gerici. That was the different, everything, pretty much the entire college was in Gerici. And only a few were outside of that. And then as we expanded, then you had to work more at community, and you had to come up with ways of bringing people together. And that's the difficulty is we got the students finally. We started to grow, and we got a library, and finally, and we got a nice humanities building, a beautiful science building. So all those things were really good for the college, but we had to continuously work on the community aspect and make sure that people still were connected in the old. And of course, we could replicate canoe trips up to the boundary waters for the whole college. It was beyond our scale. And so you have to come up with other rituals that reinforce that community. So when you asked me what was my most important value, it was the community that was created by the nuns and the lay faculty and the students and a lot of the alumni. So
you arrived at Edgewood in 1970.
1970 was September 1st. Yeah. It was 6 days after the Army Math Research building was blown up. And it was a pretty intense time. And the school, was going through, it was becoming co-ed, but it was still primarily female. I remember as a faculty member, I didn't turn 26 until October. So I showed up on campus, I was 25. Most people thought I was a student, that I was a male student. So I had to somehow, wear a suit coat that was pretty beat up, but I pretended I was a professor. And so I got to know those students very well. So we had the age difference wasn't much. I mean, it was only 3 or 4 years difference in age. And then eventually, when I taught weekend degree, many of the students were older than I was. I was teaching in 1979. I was 35, and some of the students were 40 or 45 or 50. And so I got to know them pretty well. So I had some trips down to the Laurel where we have class that would take place after the money and banking on Friday night. So. And I'm friends with many of them still. So,
could you talk a little more about the weekend degree program, because that was a pretty key program at a certain point in the college's history, and it's one that I don't think we have very well documented overall. So I'd appreciate your talking more about what that meant at the time.
Well, and it started in 1979. Sister Alice came to a few of us faculty members and said, listen, we're just going to change the schedule. We're not changing the curriculum. We're changing the schedule. And I'm going to push it through. And I'm not going to have a vote on it because it's just a change in the schedule. And I want those who are eager to help with the new schedule to volunteer. I'm not going to force people to teach in the weekend degree. So you had this kind of bifurcation in the faculty where business people, the business faculty, were going to carry the ball. So because I taught econ, I was going to have to carry that ball too. And so it was every other weekend, 3-hour classes. So you'd start at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock on Friday night, and then go to, it was initially 7 to 10, and then they felt it was too late. So 6 to 9. And then Saturday morning, 9 to 12, and then 1 to 4 on Saturday, and on Sunday morning, 9 to 12, and then Sunday afternoon, 1 to 4. The real popular one was Friday night and Saturday morning. Most people wanted to go to the football game on Saturday afternoon, and they were all hungover on Sunday. So Sunday was not the best time to teach, but I did teach on Sunday morning. It was and it became quite large and quite successful because the cost of delivering that program was not that much, not very high. You're using the same facilities. You're not, and the class sizes, my class sizes average 30, 35, average 35 in those weekend classes, because they had to get a minor in a liberal arts program because econ was considered liberal. Some people would disagree with that. I was able to then have a huge number of students who needed to get a minor in economics. And that became my bread and butter because I was working overtime then, got married then, eventually had children. So it helped me financially when the college didn't pay that much then until Jim Evans came. Our salaries were not that not that high. And of course, the nuns were contributing service. Now, eventually, Jim Eben would make them fully paid and pay them Social Security, et cetera. So Jim did wonderful things because everything was going in the right direction then. So weekend degree was really critical. And the most important person was Helen Daly, Sister Helen Daly, who ran the program. And she did it on a purse string, a shoestring. And she worked Friday night, Saturday, Sunday. And then she worked all during the week doing other things. She was unbelievable. And then Sister Jean Richter helped with the human issues aspect of the weekend degree. Human issues also probably is not known very well, but it was a very important part of the curriculum. And I was participating in it because I got to know the first director, John Kane, quite well, became lifelong friends with him. So, I could write, if you want to, get me in the right mood, I could write up some of that stuff and have it corroborated. But there are not many people still alive that, can bring that knowledge base. So yeah, very critical, very critical. And then it grew. It got so big that we didn't have space for it, and that's when it started moving out to Deming Way, and that created a whole different atmosphere. But I participated in it. For me, it was a good way of staying in touch with students, and those students, I think, eventually would be alumni who would contribute to helping with annual fundraising, et cetera. I think the alumni stuff will start coming into play because it wasn't until 1990 that we really had a solid student base that could help with the Alumni Association. It was too scattered and two different people. People were, they were there for 2 years and they would go on there, they'd come in and finish in 2 years. So there wasn't a real steady 4-year cohort that you could cultivate. A lot of that did exist back in the early 70s, but those people, they only numbered a handful. We'd have a class of 100 graduating, but by the time things got better, it was up to 300, 400 graduating each year. So it's an unusual configuration of events. As I said, about every 9 years, we went through kind of a transformation, like a new evolving of different departments and different aspects. And of course, initially, when the nursing program was introduced, they thought it was going to take off like crazy, but that was during the AIDS crisis. And so the number of students did not grow as fast as they thought. It was a tough time in the 80s for every department. And it wasn't until the 90s that things began to take off with nursing, took off with biology very nicely, took art therapy, all the art programs did very well in the 90s. And then the nursing got really big in the 2000s. So, but that's also when business started to go through negative kind of vibes that affected their enrollments. So every 9 years, something changed. And it would take a lot of faculty to sit back and reflect on that, get a round table view on it. Because those people are younger. A lot of the, John Fields and people like that, Ian Davies, they know that history of the 1990s and 2000s. So, but got to get them before they retire. I think Bob Terrell's retiring. Bob's a good person to talk to. Have you interviewed Bob Terrell?
He is on my list.
Yeah, for sure, get Bob Terrell. He's got a big heart and he did a lot. Yeah. And of course, Jeannie Leap, who I was on the search committee for Jeannie Leap. I was very proud of hiring her. She's fantastic. So again, there's still some gems around. Make sure you capture their ideas and their reflections and corroborate whether what I say matches what they think.
Right, of course. And you had a good vantage point for seeing some of these changes and evolutions, because I know when you sent me the very extensive list of what you taught at the college, you also served on a number of committees throughout your time.
But Board of Trustees was probably my most important. Search committees. Search committees are invisible. I was a mentor. I didn't mention that, but I mentored faculty. Fazil Hayati is one of my mentors. just yeah, I had my hands in different things. Uh, Administration was not my strong point, but I could capture the gist of things with an image of sorts and move us from one point to another. I was a convener of the faculty, so I worked with faculty very closely. Um, so yeah, I played different roles. But
Are there any moments or memories that stand out to you in particular from your many decades of teaching? I know you've referred to some of the stories that you liked to tell in class, and I'm
yeah,
curious if there are other memories of the teaching part of your career that stay with you.
well, the, they're kind of invisible. The, the faculty student interactions at Christmas time or at Mardi Gras. We used to celebrate Mardi Gras a little bit. Those are invisible, but conversations where you have a connection with the students. And then at the end of my career, I was teaching a lot of material and economics, and I wanted to use oral exams as opposed to written exams. And so I had one-on-one exams with students in money and banking in particular because of all the stuff happening in the financial world with securitized mortgage obligations, things like that, and derivatives. And so I could teach individually with them only after they read a book, but they had to read the book. And some of them afterwards said, this is the first book I've read from page 1 to page N. And they had never finished a book before, and they were almost seniors. So that's an invisible satisfaction that I said, okay, we'll sit down and talk about this for the next 45 minutes. And I want to see what you learned, and I'll interact with you. And it so happened some of those players were on the basketball team that year that they went to the playoffs, and I went to see them. And so I played a lot of sports in girls. So there's aspects of me that the education outside the classroom was just as important as what went on inside. And that's why, especially when we started moving towards not weekend degree, but online learning, I would not have functioned in online learning. It's just completely, I could do a little bit of it, write up things, but it's the interaction with the student outside the classroom on all kinds of things that matter to me. So that's, in general, all of my, and then just recently, I think you got one of my African American students, Mark Lowry got picked for an alumni award. And I got to know him because we grew up on the South Side together. And so we talked basketball outside of class. And so it was outside of class that I got to know him. Keith French and other South Shores. We're still in touch. These are people that I have contact with. And so that's a lifelong gift. And it's a two-way gift. I give to them, they give to me. So that's probably the most important part of the teaching. And that's where the odd core of the retort comes in. Heart speaks to heart. And that's hard to maintain. That's hard to maintain, and especially in this political environment that we have. But, I would get along with the conservative students, and they would respect what I came from. And I wasn't an ideologue in the classroom. So, but they knew where I stood politically. So.
Yeah, those are wonderful. Those are wonderful memories. And I'm curious, you've mentioned how the view of business or economics had changed towards the end of your career. Could you expand on that a little bit as we talk about the end of your
one thing
time
that
at
happened,
Edgewood?
it was set up by Sister Anthony Daniel. She was the head of the business department. She wanted students to know econ, and she encouraged them to even take money in banking. And so that made my life a lot easier. Then in the 2000s, they went through a lot of reorganization, and they created some kind of new model of teaching, et cetera. And I wasn't that involved in it, but they sort of, as soon as I was moving into phased retirement, they they pulled the rug out from beneath and said, okay, we only need one course in economics. Whereas many of the students were taking three, and many of the students would get a minor or a double major in econ. So it really undercut the social science department. And so I felt a little bit, not betrayed, but they weren't willing to take me on straight and have a discussion with me. They did it behind my back. And once I was in phased retirement, because I was most of the time bouncing back and forth from Switzerland to the US. And it left a little bit of a sourness in my mouth that they weren't willing to. And that whole thing resulted in a not so happy situation. A lot of people left. There was discord, etc. So that was not a happy time. So, but econ for me is living and breathing econ. But I don't teach the straight economic doctrine. You genuflect at the altar of free enterprise, maximizing shareholder value, and all that stuff. I believe in a different ethical framework within which the institutions that support diverse activities have to be much more cognizant of the distribution of income, how people's lives are affected by technological change. How do you manage technological change? How do you protect workers' rights? But then also look at what some of the unions do to protect incompetence too. So you got to look at both sides of the coin. So that's how I taught as much as I was able to do. I try not to be ideological, but to look at how do you talk about the facts? What are the facts? And where is truth? and how do you get to the truth? And of course, there was the phase that there are no truths outside the gates of Eden. So you're only getting partial truths in this life. So
in preparation for our interview today, I did go back and watch one or two of the clips that you had filmed for public television, because I know you had many other outlets as well.
Yeah, well, I got lucky. They called me up and had me come in, and in 1990, I did Wisconsin Week for one show with actually Frederica Runge, but her name is Frederica something around now. Anyway, she was very young then. So that was my first show, but then I got involved in the weekend program, which was a live program, which was really a lot of fun. And so I was the only economist who was willing to just ad lib. I mean, they loved me because I would come in and just say, "Oh, let's just talk," we'll ad lib. And if you want to play the little games, I'll play games and things like that, and try to explain economic concepts in a roundabout way. So they liked my flexibility. But I got on the Tom Clark show, which was a call-in show. And in 1992, during the election year, running up, I was on almost every week for a while. And then I was on off and on for the next 18 years. So it was a nice gig. I lived only a mile, not even a mile away. I could walk. They could call me up and say, "Hey, can you come in?" And I'd walk to the stadium, put my suit on, and not the stadium, but the humanities building at Park and University. So I was a very flexible person. And at first, they used the weekend program would pay me $100. And so when my children knew I got the $100, it was time to go out and buy new gym shoes so they could be the coolest ones with the best gym shoes around. So I always viewed it as a kind of a treat that I made an extra $100 for them. So yeah, so that was a nice gig. It was a nice gig. And then I got involved in NIFO. That was Bill Wilcox funded that with grant money. And I got to do that economic education stuff with the teachers. And so I always, I said, well, it's my end of my career. And I said, well, those who, the old phrase, those who can't teach and those who can't teach teachers to teach. So I was teaching teachers how to teach financial education, but I didn't believe a lot of it. That's the problem. Anybody who looked at my credit card history would be look askance at how I played it too close to the edge and things like that. But I had to. I was taking my family to Switzerland every year, so it was getting pretty expensive. So my financial education stretched out a little bit, trying to keep my family happy. But we had wonderful experience. We had spent a year in 1997, 98 where my son went to second grade and learned Swiss German. My daughter was in preschool, and we went back in 2001, 2002 for a while. He was in second grade, and then she was in second grade. He was in sixth grade. So my children got to be bilingual because of my ability to finance those trips to Switzerland. So my wife and I got married in 1985. So we're celebrating our 40th anniversary in a few weeks. So, and our daughter's expecting a baby in December. So that's a nice confluence of events. So
Congratulations.
thank you. Very happy to
And
smile.
you've lived in Switzerland year-round since 2015?
Yes. But my language skills are terrible, because so many people speak English here. And I know a little German, I know a little French, I know a little Spanish. So I can get by in little things. But as far as reading some of the medical stuff I'm having to read now, I don't understand any of it. So I have to pay my wife to translate for me. So no, but I promised my wife that if once I retired, she's 10 years younger than I am. So she had still time to go teach. And so that teaching gig she got has paid off handsomely. So it's been a win-win situation. I have a great time here. I've made a lot of friends. I smile a lot, and I just enjoy everyday life. I walk downtown every day. And so it's about, I was getting between 7,000 and 9,000 steps a day. So I have to keep that up. I'm recovering from a stroke, but that stroke was 3 months ago, and I'm feeling much better now. So I'm getting up there in age, though. I'm 81, so my sister's 88, my other sister's 86, and my brother passed away 2 years ago. So he was almost 87. So anyway, I've had a wonderful life.
And I'm so glad that you are on the road to recovery.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I'm curious, living in Switzerland, how that has affected your vantage point on economics in the US.
Yeah, well, Switzerland is so exceptional, and they're so rich because everybody puts their money and protects it there. And they've gotten rid of a lot of illegal stuff, but it's still, and they haven't fought a war since 1815 or something like that. So, they've not lost any lives to, and so it's such a difference because war and America are almost synonymous, and how important since 9/11, the notion of serving the country and being part of the military and what all that is a little overwhelming from my perspective, but anyway, I don't want to get into the country is so large, 340 million people. Switzerland has 8.5 million people. There's just no comparison. The immigration here is probably as important. 30% of the people are foreign born, but they need the labor. And many of those people are doctors because the Swiss have not trained enough doctors to meet their new population. The population has grown by 30% over the last 30 years. They haven't built any more medical capacity to train doctors. They're importing doctors from Holland and Germany and Austria, and that's a little bit selfish on their part and not looking at the big picture. Healthcare is probably the most important issue confronting every major industrial country. And so to not train doctors, I think the United States physicians' assistants, having physicians who are trained to a certain level and can serve as entry point, that was a brilliant innovation. So the United States has been very innovative in that respect. Trouble is that they haven't been innovative in other areas where they can deliver the services to the people. I mean, on the south side of Chicago, where I'm from, and my family still lives on the south side, to find a hospital that's not a trauma center and waiting rooms at the emergency rooms are not 12 hours long, that's also a real serious issue. So each country has its own issues. Economics is very local, very local. And that's what you have to start with. You have to look at the local situation. And for a country like the United States that's so large, you can't talk about California with the same breath as Louisiana or Georgia or Maine. Or it's such a complex country, and so that's the challenge. That's economics is always, I view it as the production and reproduction of everyday life. That should be the essence of it. And how do we do that now, especially with the technology that's changing so rapidly? And how is it with the distribution of income? And that's got to be the main focus of how do you get income distributed in a fair and equitable way where people can live their decent lives. And what's happening now with the shutdown, the SNAP benefits, things like that. But it's just everyday life. What's happening to farmers? Farmers are having a difficult time because of shortage of labor, trade deals that are not necessarily well thought out. You could teach a whole course on the global economy without blinking an eye because it's happening. So that's what I taught mostly at the end. That's where it's at. Comparative economic systems. You have to look at the role of religion. You have to look at the role of culture. You have to look at the role of women. You have to look at the role of inheritance and other things like that. All of those are institutional aspects of how you should teach economics. So, but they don't learn it in courses anymore. They learn about the tangent to the XY axis and things like that. I'm not criticizing math. I did the math. I can do math. But I don't want to just teach that to the students.
Mhm. It sounds like you still follow your field very closely.
Oh, I do. Yeah. I've a subscription to The Economist, which is getting pretty expensive. And I read different publications, different little podcasts. And yeah, so I stay very active. So it's all in my head.
I'm curious if I could ask you to share your thoughts on the Edgewood College, now Edgewood University,
Well,
of the future, because you were a part of its
20 years. They were talking about it for 20 years. The nursing program, I think, is one of the best programs around. And if they're offering a PhD or an ED or nursing administration, they have the skill and the knowledge and the history to do that, and they'll be providing a valuable service. Education has been doing it for a long time. It's been a little scattered, but they got good people, I think. Business has to be regenerative, but I think some of the new people will probably be able to do that. One person you should talk to is Elaine Bobian. Do you have her on your list? Because she's was very critical in the business program over the years. So she would give you a better history of that. So business faltered in the last 10 to 15 years, but they've got to regenerate themselves. So whether they'll be able to deliver the goods, so to speak, in a university setting, their MBA was very good, but it got a little rusty. So they lost good people. So that's the problem. Can you attract good people? How much are you paying them? What investment are they making? Is it and again, that whole notion of community. How do you reestablish that? In a graduate program, it's not that easy. It's a very, very different zeitgeist, so to speak, for graduate programs. So I wish them well. They've got to survive. They got a good location. They've got a good, I think you've got good leadership. You just have to somehow attract the students because we got demographics that are working against us and cultural norms that are changing and things like that. When Cardinal Stritch went under, and I heard that Northland has gone under, Milton went under in the 80s. Yeah, you're going to see some sorting out. So let's hope everybody can pull together and get the alumni involved, and that will make a big difference, I think. So yeah, it was inevitable. I had a vision. I told it to Dan Carey or one time in a conversation that I saw Dominican University, another university that's Dominican in Michigan. I said, what if you created a consortium and developed graduate programs that you wouldn't overcompete, but you would have a Dominican stamp on it? And he didn't buy that argument. But I just felt it was important that Dominican had a library program and another program. We had nursing and things like that. We had Jim Lorman's program with conservation and issues related to the environmental science. Those are kinds of things that you want to promote in specific ways. What's fitting your institution, and of course, Madison being such a healthcare area, nursing is perfect. Yeah. So it's had to be. It's evolution. Every 9 years it goes through an evolution. So see what happens over the next 9 years. I hope I make it that long. So.
And when you shared that thought with me and said that the first word you used when I asked about the vision for Edgewood of the future was survival. You really witnessed several eras when survival was on the line.
I used to. Here's an anecdote. I used to teach students who were at-risk students in the summer, like a program we put together with a guy named Endeman. And we had students who actually got money from the Madison Community Foundation to give them $2,000 if they finished the course that they could use for college. We had a lot of restrictions, but we had this one African American students, and her name was Tabitha, and we started doing research on stocks, and we suggested that she look at Johnson and Johnson and Sears, and she says, Sears? Why would I be interested in going to Sears? She's that's the store you walk through to get to the rest of the mall. And she said that in 2000. So that was her saying. She said, that's the store you walk through to get to other stores. And she said, I'm not going to invest. I'm not going to look at Sears. Sears is gone. It's dead. And so there's a case of a 16-year-old kid, a 17-year-old kid who could summarize a situation perfectly just by using a phrase. And of course, that's where you have to look at universities and colleges. They have to keep evolving. They have to keep evolving. That's necessary. It's a necessary condition. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. You got to keep, and then you got to get good people to stay and provide the necessary warmth and community that students will feel like they're valued every day when they go to school and when they go to class. So.
Bill, thank you for giving me the chance to ask you so many questions today.
It's been fun.
Before we finish, I want to give you an opportunity if there are any other areas that you'd like to share that I haven't covered in our conversation.
No, I think we've covered a good part of territory. You've asked me all kinds of questions. I've tried to answer them. I think I'm getting tired.
My goodness, thank you so much for your time. This was a real pleasure.
Okay, you take care.
All right, have a good night.
Bye-bye.